to the Eastside Freedom Library. I'm Peter, co-executive director here. Hopefully you've signed our guest book, and there are restrooms downstairs. And this is part of a monthly series that we do with Ramsey County Historical Society called History Revealed. And we've had some great programs, and we will have some more great programs. So I want to encourage you also to wander around the desk and pick up flyers for upcoming events. There's a lot happening here in the next couple of weeks. And pay attention to what's going on here at the Eastside Freedom Library. So I want to introduce Robin Priestley with Ramsey County Historical Society, who's going to tell us a little bit about their work and also introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter and Clarence and Carla and everybody from the Eastside Freedom Library. We're so pleased to have this partnership. It's a great space. And thank you all for coming out for this program. I also want to thank Subtext Books for coming and helping us by selling books. So the books from Dr. Cooley's talk will be, Sue has them in the back. They'll be available after the program for purchase and signing. And I know that she can take any kind of monetary format that you have. So, yes, she says yes, she will do that. Well, barter maybe, but yeah. Again, thank you all for coming. I want to remind you that this presentation is made possible by the members of the Ramsey County Historical Society. We don't get grant money. So if you're interested in a membership to support these programs, you can see me afterwards. And in addition to helping out our programs, you also get a discount off of our books. You get our quarterly award-winning magazine, Ramsey County History, that covers all sorts of topics of history in Ramsey County. And you also get discounts and free admission at our historic site, Gibbs Farm, which is up on Larpenteur in Cleveland. That will be opening up on Memorial Day weekend in the summer, plus discounts on day camps if you have kids or grandkids. And so there's all kinds of more benefits as well. So again, thank you for interest, for coming, and those of you who are members. Our upcoming programs, we've got flyers in the back about more History Revealed programs. Thursday, January 16th at Waldman's Brewery over on Smith Street in St. Paul. Dan Reed will be talking about St. Paul's historic Ramsey Hill, salvaging a gilded past. Reservations are needed for that. If you're interested, again, see me after the program. Then on Thursday, January 23rd, Julie L'Enfant will be talking about the celebrity portraits of Nicholas R. Brewer. She has a new book out about Nicholas Brewer, who's a famous portrait artist. And that's up at the Roseville Library on Hamlin in Roseville. And we have a lot more programs. Again, the flyer's in the back by Sue. So I want to introduce our speaker for tonight. Dr. Will Cooley is a historian of the 20th century United States. He grew up in Villard, Minnesota, earned his BA at Hamlin University and his PhD at the University of Illinois. He was a professor of history at Walsh University in Ohio and is now a community faculty member at Metro State. He has published articles about labor, immigration, and African American history, and his current project, The People's War, The American Addiction to Punitive Drug Policies, is under review at the University of North Carolina Press's Justice and Power series. So again, we'll have the current book in the back, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Will Cooley. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much to the Ramsey County Historical Society and Eastside Freedom Library for hosting me. It's great to have an audience of any size. One time I went out to speak in Long Beach, California at a conference. It was on the Queen Mary. The conference was on the Queen Mary. And I got there and I had an audience of 3. And one of which was my wife and our newborn child. And as soon as I started speaking, she started crying, of course. And so they had to leave the room, and then I had an audience of 1 of them. So I went all the way from Ohio to Long Beach to speak to one person. Thanks to Peter for setting this up. I went to Hamlin, but I took my labor history courses at McAllister. And there was actually a professor at Hamlin who said, I'm kind of tired of you. You should go down the road to Peter's classes because you keep talking about Marx, and we're not really interested in that, so go down to McAllister and see what you can do there. And I think one thing that Peter taught me, among many things, was compassion for my subjects, for the historical subjects. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the book today, and I hope that comes through. Compassion for these subjects that we're striving in Chicago. I tried not, and maybe this is a selling point, it's only 130 pages, the book, so I tried not to tell the entire story of the black middle class in Chicago. I didn't want an encyclopedia. So what I did is I found spots where African Americans came to Chicago and tried to rise and found resistance, and then how they tried to push through that resistance. So the first part is talking about African Americans coming to Chicago, and a lot of historians said, well, they had very modest goals when they came to Chicago. Not true. They thought this was the promised land. They thought they were going to make it. I talked a lot about the clean collar. That's what it was called back then. I want a job. People coming from Mississippi, Alabama with a clean collar. Once they got some of those jobs in a roundabout way, then they started moving out of the neighborhoods they were segregated into. And so the second chapter talks about moving out. And we've talked a lot about restrictive covenants here in Minneapolis. I was looking at the mapping prejudice projects, and you can see all the places that have that clause in there, Caucasian only. This is very true, and it's been very damaging. However, I talk a lot about how blacks didn't care about those clauses, of course. They were going to move into these neighborhoods regardless, and they were going to do what they had to do to push out and find new neighborhoods. There's a lot of armed self-defense in Chapter 2. Chapter 3, I look at the neighborhood of Chatham, which is on the south side, and that's a neighborhood I call Can the Middle Class Save Chicago, because that's where my research started originally. I found this neighborhood that had integrated, and all these articles about how wonderful it was, and I wanted to know how that happened and then what happened to it. And it's kind of a tragedy as the white middle class people move out, trickle out slowly out of that neighborhood. And then Chapter 4 is what I'm going to talk about today. Breaking through in the corporate workplace. So this comes from Chapter 4, and it's not necessarily Chicago specific. I try to open it up a little bit, and I think that's good. Sometimes when I'm presenting, people have very specific Chicago questions. You know, Chicago people are very serious about their city, and so they want the nitty-gritty on, can you talk about 63rd Street and its effect on the black middle class? And I can, but I'm going to open this up a little bit because this is kind of a national story. So in 1956, Charles Chuck Harrison began searching for an industrial design career in Chicago. He had a bachelor's degree from the Art Institute of Chicago and a master's from Illinois Institute of Technology. He was born in Louisiana, and he heard from a friend that a firm was hiring. But when Harrison showed up the next day, they suddenly no longer needed help. Undeterred, the former college classmates at the venerable Chicago retailer Sears said he should come in and apply for an opening. The department manager, Carl Bjornkrantz, I should be able to say that, Norwegian name, had a liberal reputation. And Harrison filled out the application and took a battery of personnel tests. On his next visit, however, Carl regretfully informed him, Chuck, I have to tell you, it turns out I can't hire you. I know you need an explanation, I'm going to tell it like it is. Sears has an unwritten policy against hiring black people. Harrison actually admired his rare frankness. Most people wouldn't tell him why he was not getting hired. And Carl, who later became a friend, was able to assist Harrison in finding freelance jobs. Harrison's reputation in the city grew, and he no longer had to look for work, people looked for him. In 1961, Carl called back, quote, well, Chuck, we can hire you now. Harrison accepted that job at Sears, becoming the first African-American in a white-collar position at that company. Nobody in here probably knows who Chuck Harrison is. He's not an inventor, he's a designer, industrial designer. But you know what he did. Remember the viewfinder? Right? You put the thing in the viewfinder and you could click through. That's him. That's his design. His other one is durable plastic, large garbage cans. So every morning when you're not awoken to the sound of garbage men throwing those metal garbage cans, if you've seen old movies, right, they're always tossing around those metal garbage cans, waking up the entire neighborhood. That's him. he came up with a durable plastic garbage can for Sears. So he's in the Designer Hall of Fame. He's a big deal in his field. Though Harrison had arrived by breaking the race barrier and landing a job at Sears, in many ways his struggles had just begun. In the 1960s and 70s, black Americans initiated a period of change in employment practices. As the civil rights movement bore fruit, African Americans experienced unparalleled upward mobility and pressed forward into formerly lily-white workplaces, forcing often reluctant white co-workers and supervisors to accept them. Now, scholars have looked a lot at this change, and usually they look at it from the perspective of the white corporations or the politicians and minimize the role played by the primary actors, African Americans who were going into these workplaces. One contends that affirmative action was, quote, largely the construction of white male elites who traditionally have dominated government business. Revisionist historians have said that corporations were much more liberal on racial matters than they've been given credit for and played a leading role in opening the American workplace to minorities. These historians contend that socially responsible, open-minded employers started a form of affirmative action before the government actually required it. By the mid-1980s, one argues, large corporations were, quote, affirmative action's most credible champions, and, quote, a real powerful force for racial progress in the United States. This would have been a real surprise for the African Americans who were actually working in these places. Though minorities could not have entered the corporate world without the help of some enlightened white gatekeepers, people like Karl Bjornkrantz, it was the minority trailblazers who shouldered the majority of the burden in this experiment to integrate. Blacks realized that to join the middle class, they'd have to achieve a share of this growing white-collar sector. And they were not only the most reliable champions of affirmative action, they were the instigators of it. With the exceptions of a few progressive corporations, big business either rejected equal opportunity or tried to evade it. Even when company leaders agreed to make minority hiring a priority, the giant bureaucracies underneath them often resisted any changes. Black pioneers needed to negotiate these newly integrated and frequently hostile workplaces while dealing with the issues of racial authenticity, personal stress, and the cost of living the good life. So until the 1960s, white-collar work in America was more or less a white preserve, especially in the private sector. Business Week noted in 1954 that civil rights triumphs had opened up more and more jobs, but blacks were still generally prohibited from, quote, a job that a white man could do in a clean collar. In 1957, the black magazine Color reported that the Department of Labor's Dictionary of Occupational Titles listed 17,000 jobs. Blacks could realistically aspire to fill about 100 of these, 17,100. The near exclusion of blacks became even more calamitous as the country gradually shifted to a post-industrial economy. Careers in the professions, management and clerical work, and sales accounted for 97% of the total increase in employment in the mid-1940s through the 1960s. Many civil rights organizations realized this. If they were going to keep on advancing, they were going to have to crack these barriers in white-collar careers. Yet though blacks had long demanded to be a part of corporate America, the vast majority of white companies were caught off guard when they started pushing for these jobs. White executives delighted in technical and production innovations, but most of these same men were overwhelmingly conservative when it came to social and political matters, with many believing that blacks had no place in the office unless they operated a mop and broom. Textbooks and training management manuals assured executives that certain groups were not fit for Mahogany Row. Chester Barnard's The Functions of the Executive, which was a staple of college business classes in management theory, it was in its 18th printing in 1968, stressed that decision makers, quote, must have social compatibility, and that minorities, quote, lack the fitness for organizational collaboration. The author instructed that regardless of competence, quote, outsiders cannot be promoted or selected because they, quote, do not fit. Though white executives reacted to the civil rights movement in a variety of ways, unsurprisingly, given their backgrounds and training, the majority remained deeply reluctant to hire African Americans and other minorities. A consultant candidly stated that, quote, for many businesses, an equal employment opportunity program is unpleasant, annoying, and expensive. Hidebound business leaders simply fell back on their existing stereotypes to resist hiring and promoting blacks, asserting that they lacked ambition, time management skills, and had intelligence deficiencies. An anonymous official at a large company spoke to the Wall Street Journal and said, quote, "A fairly high percentage of Negroes, as compared to whites, are totally irresponsible in their attitude toward the company, the public, and their jobs." The official claimed that even college-educated blacks were turning business facilities into, quote, "centers for the sale of illegal drugs, policy slips, horse betting, and call girls." Let's face it, the former Avis CEO Robert Townsend wrote in his 1970s bestseller, "The vast majority of corporations are still operating with the dice loaded against Jews, black people, and women of all races and creeds." So I'm not necessarily buying this notion from historians that it was corporations that were instigating affirmative action. I think the evidence suggests otherwise. But by the 1960s, largely as a result of civil rights pressures, African Americans were beginning to make their mark in offices that were once off limits to them. Yet their trials were just beginning when they were hired. Though they were often expected to, quote, "represent the race," and, quote, "set a good example" by both white employers and fellow African Americans, blacks in the salaried ranks were far from homogenous. They varied in attitudes, goals, feelings about the civil rights movement, and the significance of their racial identities. The challenge of adjusting was difficult for any man or woman from a working class background, regardless of race. Most blacks did not have parents, relatives, family, or friends who had an understanding of the customs of corporate work. The transition was difficult, but race added an extra layer. Though radical militants accused middle-class blacks of blending into white society, as the cultural critic Albert Murray observed, quote, "The minute a Negro moves into any integrated situation in the U.S., he becomes blacker than ever before." Many encountered awkward interpersonal dealings. Black hires were, quote, "constantly called on to interpret the actions of all Negroes, the janitor, the secretary, Whitney Young, H. Rap Brown. Most did not consider themselves qualified to give the black opinion and found it demeaning that whites thought that blacks all thought alike on civil rights and black power matters." One said, "I developed the feeling that I was considered black first and an individual second." He felt that he was constantly on stage for whites at the office, that they not only wanted to see how he could perform, but how he'd react to racially sensitive situations in and out of the workplace. Not surprisingly, these situations came up often. Just through their physical presence, black pioneers had integrated the middle-class workplace. Yet levels of intimacy and professional integration were processes with delicate negotiations. An African-American man promoted to stock supervisor at Carson Peary Scott was lauded for his ability to fit in, but had to be warned by his white bosses about, quote, "integrating too fast," because white coworkers had complained that when he asked them to go out for coffee, he was being too forward with them. Due to these admonitions, black pioneers walked on eggshells. At once they were part of the company, yet unsure if a casual gesture could violate these indefinite and ever-changing racial taboos. From senior black executives, they lived with the knowledge that they could be put in their place at any moment, whether through building security, always asking them for their credentials, or being mistaken for the delivery man. The welcome these pioneers got in most middle-class workplaces was often no welcome at all. Indeed, most black employees were met with awkwardness at best and downright hostility and transparent discrimination at worst. Even most white liberals were clueless on how to act around or talk to African Americans. Edward Boyd, who rose up at the Pepsi Company, found white coworkers not to be reactionaries, but generally unenlightened. And they were surprised at he was surprised at how sheltered they were and had never really been around African Americans before. African American workers were almost certain to encounter N-word jokes. And a black manager noted that telling an ethnic gag was, quote, kind of a ticket to admission at management meetings. And I found this over and over and over, that this is one of the things that white males had really hard trouble giving up, the gags and the jokes. Consultants warned black management novices that racial humor was inevitable, but they must walk a tightrope between coming off as the chairman of the Black Panther Party and step and fetch it. And that was actually from a black consultant warning other African Americans about what it was going to be like in the workplace. One African American talked about his first day at work. His white coworkers hung up a giant George Wallace for President sign in his office. And he said some of them kind of thought it was a joke, I think, but he's like, not funny, right? This is my first day at work, and you're making it very difficult for me. But I want to shift here to perseverance, because despite the impediments for African Americans entering corporate America, this was matched by a striking perseverance from pioneers across the country. Walter Clark came to Chicago with an accounting degree in 1951. He got no offers. Undaunted, he enrolled in a master's degree at DePaul while taking odd jobs. He finally got an accounting clerk position at First Federal Savings and Loan in 1955. He was the first black employee. Though better educated than any of his coworkers, he stagnated at the entry level. Quote, when your supervisors come to you for help for simple calculations, you know you're getting screwed. Clark finally began to move up the company ladder after 7 years, and then after self-educating himself in bond trading, he convinced First Federal to let him set up a highly profitable trading unit inside the firm. By 1974, Clark's patient persistence proved worthwhile. He was senior vice president in charge of their investment program. For newcomers like Clark, pioneering was a paradoxical experience. It entailed heavy burdens, but the payoff in terms of legacy and personal rewards could be profoundly satisfying. Despite the stress, determined African Americans regularly took pride in the role of trailblazer. As one of the first African Americans to achieve a top executive position in a white corporation, E. Frederick Morrow stated that quitting was not an option because it, quote, gives delight and comfort to one's enemies and oppressors. Morrow was an African American in the Eisenhower cabinet and thought he could make a transition into the corporate world. It was rough in the Eisenhower cabinet. It was even more rough in the corporate world. One of the things he talks a lot about is he would be at work from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and then he would come to work on Monday, and all these things had been decided. And he's like, what's going on here, right? I don't understand. Well, the country club, which he was not allowed to be a part of, was he was just amazed at how many decisions got made on putting greens in these big corporations. And so he was completely shut out. So one of the things he tried to do is get more involved in the cocktail circuit and the country club circuit. He found that was even more challenging than getting involved in the corporation. Plus the joke thing again. He talks in his autobiography, he talks a lot about a couple drinks that these guys had, and all of a sudden the nastiness would come out. And he realized he didn't want to be a part of that anymore. I got another example, Jim Clinton. He became the first executive with the American airline industry at TWA, and he felt, quote, I had to develop an image which would make it difficult, if not impossible, for an individual to say that a black man could not hold down an executive position with a major airline. Many blacks felt they were indebted to previous generations who had sacrificed so much to move them up, whether through the civil rights agitation or just plain hard work. Quote, my parents killed themselves putting me through school. They both had 2 jobs. I hardly ever saw them, a dress designer recalled. Now I've got my chance. Blacks in white collars adopted to corporate life using a variety of tactics. Among the most essential was thick skin. To be successful, black managers could not be derailed by the racial prejudice of others. They were not self-deluded. Their daily experiences reminded them of the reality of racism and discrimination. But they had to implement a mindset that if others chose to perceive them in a negative light because of their race, this was the bigot's problem. Black managers networked to discuss survival tactics. There's a whole bunch of black networking organizations that spring up during this time. And they could be beneficial in advancing careers, but they also served as a place to vent and deal with workplace frustration. Quote, the only thing that keeps my head intact is the chance to go out with other black executives now and then and talk that talk, a black personnel recruiter admitted. It's a mental health device to be able to call the man a motherfucker once in a while. This resolve led to acutely gratifying experiences for African Americans in corporate America. Though nearly all encountered racially motivated slights, they acknowledged it was worth it to stay in the system because it so clearly was an improvement over being shut out. Some blacks in managerial jobs reported coworkers and supervisors had accepted them. Those surveys of blacks in white-collar jobs showed that a good number were frustrated. They also revealed that they had a positive outlook on their future. This is in the early 70s. A poll of 500 black business professionals in private industry in 1971 found that slightly more than half were satisfied with their career progress, and 2/3 thought they had fared well or better than whites with similar backgrounds and abilities. More than 3/5 considered their relations with white supervisors, coworkers, and subordinates to be good or excellent. However, that same proportion also felt they did not have the same opportunities for advancement as their white counterparts. Promotions remained a problem. A lot of African Americans got shunted into something many came to call the relations, community relations, human relations. Those were not the decision-making jobs, and they were not the ones that moved you up in the corporation. One guy said, my only job here is to give away baseball tickets, and I don't feel like I have that real opportunity to move up. Despite numerous extra struggles white-collar blacks faced, they knew that their prospects had improved significantly over those of their parents. A lot of them in Chicago talk about having educated parents. The only job they could find was the post office. PhDs, Phi Beta Kappa people working in the post office in Chicago. In addition, corporate work, let's face it, became very lucrative at this time. Managerial positions gave blacks the ability to take on residents in Fat City and to enhance their prospects for their children. Quote, "They gave you the good bucks and a taste of the good life, and it's hard to leave it," an executive affirmed. "You get caught up in that bag and assimilate in order to enjoy the benefits." Ebony magazine, of course, was very good at these beautiful spreads, color spreads of the people that had made it. Jim Clinton, that airline executive that I talked about before, was in Ebony, and they talked about how he's the grandson of a slave, and now he has a 60-foot yacht. Even African Americans who were often frustrated knew that the pay often made it worthwhile. A stymied manager recognized that while he was the company's, quote, "spook who sat by the door," quote, "I charged them well for it." Yet if blacks and white collars were in the system, for most of them, it continued to be a very unnerving existence. Chuck Harrison, who I started the story with, that first black manager at Sears, remembered that from the day he was hired until he retired in the 1990s, quote, "I was always reminded that I could not take my guard down. That I was in a hostile environment every day. Every day." When materials disappeared from the laboratory, Harrison, despite a 10-year tenure at the firm, was the only executive investigated by an outside detective agency. After 2 white technicians were discovered to be the culprits, Harrison's embarrassed supervisor gave him the largest raise he'd ever had. But this was a bittersweet end to a long line of excruciating workplaces experiences. Harrison and his co-worker commuted together from the south side of Chicago to Sears, and he said every day they would get out of the car and they would put on imaginary gas masks to go into work, because they said this is such a toxic experience for African Americans that we have to put on these imaginary gas masks. So for the first time in American history, large numbers of African Americans entered the middle class. However, it was a voyage fraught with peril, as the black middle class negotiated often reluctant and outwardly racist workplaces. Black militants also, during this period, targeted many of them as sellouts. And in the book I talk a little bit how a lot of black parents had to deal with children who saw them going off to work in these corporate workplaces and did not accept them. That the younger generation was joining these militant organizations and was very disappointed that dad was a sellout. So a lot of internal family strife during this time as well. The black middle class emerged at an inopportune time, I think anyways. If they would have come up during the Ebony magazine 1950s, or if they would have come up during the Reagan 1980s, they would have been celebrated. But the largest growth of the black middle class was during this late 60s, 70s period, and so they were getting it from all sides. Visibility brought intensified scrutiny, and members of the black middle class benefited disproportionately from the civil rights movement. There's no doubt about it. And in Chapter 4, I talk about the riots in Chicago and how the people that benefited were a lot of these black middle class people, because corporations would say, we have to do something about this, but they were the ones that benefited. I especially saw this with like beer distributorships or stuff like that. All of a sudden, Anheuser-Busch got very concerned in these inner city areas and would start giving beer distributorships to African Americans that they had no chance of this before. The other factor in Chicago is definitely Jesse Jackson. Such a powerful figure in the 1970s, and if I've gone through his papers, and he was on it. He was on everything, right? If you were not, if a corporation was not doing the right thing, Jesse Jackson was going to be knocking on your door very quickly. And the stuff he was able to negotiate with corporations during this time is just so impressive. I think he kind of drifted away from that in the 1980s when he started running for president and stuff like that. But in the 1970s, the early 80s, he was a very powerful force for getting jobs for African Americans. Michael Wilbon, who's on Pardon the Interruption on ESPN, he was on television the other day talking about his father getting fired from a corporation. His dad was a black white-collar worker. And the next morning he comes down and there's Jesse Jackson sitting with his dad at the breakfast table the next morning, like, we're going to get this taken care of, right? Really powerful figure during this period. So due to the cultural currents during this time, I think historians have neglected the role of the black middle class in crafting a more equitable America in the 1960s and 70s. Yet these men and women should have their daily struggles for the way they tried to make corporations more responsible and create equal opportunities examined and appreciated, even when they engaged in these individualized pursuits. Thank you. So feel free to fire away with any questions. Again, I just wanted to cover one of the chapters there, but it's kind of the culmination. And I could have talked a little bit more about the 1980s, because the 1980s is a retraction for this progress. The articles and even the numbers that we see with the growth of African Americans in the corporate workplace in the 1970s. In the 1980s, you start seeing all these articles about African Americans leaving the corporate workplace and becoming entrepreneurs and things like that. And then Clarence Thomas takes over the EEOC, and any sort of enforcement disappears during the Reagan era. But I want to leave us on a good note here, because I do see a lot of progress during the 1970s.
Yeah, I have a couple questions.
Yep.
First of all, can you give us a sense of the demographics, what the numbers are, how many people you're talking about in Chicago who had these kinds of jobs? And then secondly, I might be wrong about this, but I just seem to recall that most of the white-collar, middle-class jobs in Chicago came through the government. Is that correct? That the most opportunities were either government agencies or something like that?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, and so to the first point, I do have quite a bit of data from the EEOC from the early 60s, and then how that changes, right? So when I'm talking about a growth here, yeah, we're talking about a very small percentage. But I think a lot of the African Americans that I feature here, when you go from 0 to, let's say, 2%, that's still a pretty big growth. When you go from no opportunity, and the common misperception was that, well, we just can't find enough qualified African Americans. I've got an entire section that just completely debunks that. That first of all, qualified is a completely subjective thing that they were just making up, right? And when you have people educated in these business schools saying, well, people that are not like you don't fit, that was a way to keep them out, right? So I do have I can go into some of the nitty-gritty numbers so I can find the pages and stuff, but I'm talking about no opportunity to some opportunity, but it was still growth. To the second part, government jobs, yeah. And I think a lot of people have looked at more of the government jobs. I chose to focus more on the private sector here. But you do see that with African Americans breaking through in the daily machine in the 1960s. And one of the fascinating parts I found is the number of African Americans that converted to Catholicism in the 1960s because to get jobs in the fire department and the police department, you had to be Catholic. And there are some really strong black Catholic parishes along that middle class belt, right, where they converted.
But also administering Great Society programs too, right?
Yeah,
There are a
yeah.
lot of opportunities there.
Yeah, and so that's the second part to when the government cutbacks start happening in the 1980s, African Americans and white collars feel those effects much worse because of the high percentage. And a big part of that is the civil service test. Once they eliminate a lot of the subjective criteria and they have the civil service, this is why African Americans got hired in the post office in the first place. So it was based on the civil service test. It's how well you do on the test. And they did well on the test, so they got hired. Same thing with government work. If you did well on the civil service test, you got hired. They didn't have a lot of those. I could go through all the different things that corporations were doing, including, of course, interviewing their wives during this time, right? Will the wife fit in the corporation as well as the husband? And then that country club factor was a massive. I've got an entire section called the shadow corporation. All the other things that went along with this that kept African Americans out of the private sector. So I wanted to focus on that in this chapter because other people have done good work on government work. Thank you.
I don't know who I'm quoting, but it was years ago that I read that, and I'm asking if this fits in with your belief or study. That the entire term of affirmative action really has changed. That before, it originally meant finding people who could, disadvantaged minorities, that if you gave them a little bit more education or got them more experience, then they'd be on the same level in order to be, promoted to the higher levels. And then it suddenly became, well, find a person of color, disadvantaged, and put them in that place, and that's how it's become interpreted nowadays. And that was not what the original intent was. Did you?
Yeah, it's hard. I guess it's hard to tell the intent of the original authors of affirmative action and how it got implemented. I guess my point was mostly that there's been a lot of people that come along and they only focus on Kennedy and Johnson and then the people that tried to implement it from the government standpoint. My point was that no, the genesis for affirmative action is actually coming from below. And these are people demanding to get in these places. And all of a sudden, corporate America did not just open up when affirmative action was passed. It was much more difficult than that. But again, that qualified thing is something I really play with in Chapter 4. So you have insurance executives, white insurance executives saying, well, we can't find qualified African Americans for insurance jobs. Now, if you know anything about the history of Black America, Black insurance companies were all over because white insurance companies wouldn't deal with African Americans, right? They wouldn't give insurance policies. So Chicago had tons of very experienced, excellent insurance people, insurance executives, because they had their own companies, right? So for the white insurance companies to say, we can't find any, well, that's because you just weren't looking at all. There was plenty of qualified people during this time. So I think getting caught up in that affirmative action debate misses the point of what was actually going on.
So I have a few questions. One is, how are you defining middle class?
Right.
So one of the things that you just mentioned, because I was just going to ask this question, African Americans had a very strong middle class,
right,
particularly in Chicago, for decades.
Mm-hmm.
So when we look at the Black Metropolis, for instance,
yep,
which dealt with the study of the south side of Chicago, including not just the businesses that they founded, but even in terms, and you mentioned Catholics, but even because African Americans were very much a part, Sinclair, Drake, and Peyton actually even looked at how class was connected to the churches to which they belonged, from Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Catholics, etc. So the first question I have is really, how are you defining middle class when we were talking about middle class in the 60s? And how are you connecting, for instance, the Black middle class that was a part of Chicago, including black executives, to what you're in some ways verifying in terms of how black folk are entering into white corporations. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is really, so you mentioned Ebony. So Ebony had a corporate office right there on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. It was arguably one of the most successful black corporations in the 1960s, 70s, etc. That was filled with African American executives. How do you discuss those black businesses that were still quite prevalent in Chicago and had a long history with respect to ensuring black middle class educated African Americans working in corporations to what you're talking about with respect to quote unquote middle class?
Right. So the first question is a great one, right? And I've been pressed at every stage of this. How are you going to define middle class? And I think it's really interesting in America because when they do public opinion surveys, almost everybody identifies themselves as middle class in America, right? From the wealthiest, some of the wealthiest people in America say, oh, I'm just a middle class person, I have a middle class background. And working class often never really caught on in the United States the way it does in other developed countries. And so it can be defined very broadly. I tried to talk more about that white collar position and moving up and some of the markers of middle class that these people were identifying themselves.
Right, but so E. Franklin Frazier talks about the black middle class and the way African Americans define middle class, often connected to education, right? And so being middle class was being an educator. It was in some cases being a Pullman porter because they were deeply educated. It was really about the education attainment as opposed to salaries.
Right.
So I'm trying to understand how you're thinking about that when you're talking about middle class and those African Americans entering into white corporations.
Yeah. And I think in the stage that Frazier's writing about, at least early in the 1930s, he is talking more about status, but he's using that interchangeably with class. So how can I differentiate myself from the black poor and working class, and often through education? However, he also points out that Pullman porters really did not make much money, right? And I see a shift here. I see a shift in the 1950s and 1960s where money starts to really count more. And I talk about this in the book. One of the ways you can do that, of course, is move out and move into these new and growing middle-class communities. However, even that gets tricky because some of the neighborhoods that people are moving into, and to your point, government workers, black policemen, black postal workers, and government workers are making a pretty good salary at this time, who are not necessarily educated, are becoming part of this black middle-class community as well. So you have black executives right next to black policemen. There's a pretty famous incident on the south side of Chicago here where the Nation of Islam tries to set up a church, school, kind of foundation area inside this black middle class area. And the black middle class wants no part of the Nation of Islam setting up in Chatham here. And so black middle class organizes, black middle class homeowners organize, and they bring black policemen, many of which live in this community, with them to kind of intimidate the Nation of Islam. So to try to define it too narrowly, it's just executives, it's just people who own black businesses, really doesn't explore the complexity. The main thing I try to do here is show how they defined it themselves and how they were trying to divide themselves from people that live more in North Chicago, working class and poor blacks. The second part of your question, and this dovetails with your question, I think there's been great work done, especially in places like Chicago, on black business and on African American entrepreneurship. So I tried to shift that away and talk more about the big change that came in the 1960s and 1970s, where African Americans started to integrate white businesses and tell their story a little bit more. That gets complicated as well because what we see in Chicago is a lot of these African American businesses start getting bought up by white corporations, and that creates another layer of how do we feel about this? What's going to be the long-term success? It's very individualistic. Some of those guys get very rich when they take giant buyouts from white corporations. However, the company is never the same. It just kind of dissolves up, especially a lot with black hair care products, black makeup products, things like that. They just kind of disappear inside these white corporations, and African Americans do not have the authority or the hiring power that they did before. Even Johnson Publications is no more, right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, but all through the 60s and 70s, they were really quite successful.
Very successful.
At least during the period in which you're discussing.
No, yeah. I didn't really talk too much about black entrepreneurship. I talked more about integrating, because I think the civil rights movement, and I've got plenty of examples, they knew that this was going to happen. They saw the signs of the packing houses closing in Chicago. They saw the steel factories closing in Chicago. They knew this was going to have to be the next frontier. In places like Chicago, they would go to banks and they would do that resume thing. 2 resumes that look exactly the same. One coming from an African American and one coming from a white person. And when the African American got turned down, that's when they would start mobilizing. And here's where you see a lot of cross-class, because black working class people would actually join these protests with black middle class people, because they knew that that was the future, and those are the jobs their children would be in. And so I see a lot of cross-class collaboration in these protests. They saw the future, and it was service sector work.
Another question. Is that okay?
No, yeah, go ahead. I think these are great questions, actually.
So what you describe in the 1960s and 70s actually still happens today.
Yeah.
For many African American executives. It certainly was a huge issue in the 1990s.
Yep.
As close as the rage of the privileged class was something that was pretty extraordinary. I mean, talked about this issue. So, in your book, do you bring that forward? Because the way you're describing it, at least in the chapter, and forgive me, it sounds like the issue happened in the 60s and 70s, but then it somehow got better or worse. But that what you're describing, many black executives experienced even up to today.
Absolutely. As I said, if you follow it further, I think things get worse in the 80s, not better. And here's the opening of my conclusion. In 2009, the New York Times reported that job-seeking African Americans were whitening their job resumes. For example, businesses were not returning calls for job interviews to Tahani Tompkins, a Chicagoland resident. A friend advised her to change her name to T.S. Tompkins to better her chances. Another Chicagoan deleted information on her bachelor's degree from Hampton University, a historically black college. Additionally, she removed details on a previous position in an African-American nonprofit and reshuffled her references to ensure that the top names were not black-sounding. This is 2009. So I definitely do not see this as... I see the 70s as a period of progress, no doubt about it. But after that, I do not see the enlargement of the black middle class. And definitely the neighborhood I focus on here, Chatham, on the south side, which is about at 75th Street, if you're on the Dan Ryan Expressway. That used to be the cradle of the black middle class, and whenever Ebony would run articles on where do you want to live when you've made it in Chicago, it had neighborhoods like Pill Hill. So many doctors lived there, and these giant houses that they called it Pill Hill. Palmer Woods was another one in Detroit. Chatham's fallen on really hard times, and that's a very complicated story on why this happened. But it had a lot to do with disinvestment in the South. Talk about two cities, like Chicago, two cities, right? The South Side and the North Side. So different in so many different ways. And I talk a lot about building wealth and how most people in America, most white people build wealth through home. Your home appreciates, you sell it, you make money off that. For various reasons, that did not happen on the south side of Chicago. And so they weren't able to build that intergenerational wealth and pass it down to their children the way that someone on the north side would. And even in the 1960s, they faced something called the Chicago Wall. Almost all suburbs, especially on the north side, were closed to African Americans. So in Chatham, for instance, Ernie Banks, the Chicago Cubs baseball star, lives in this neighborhood in Chicago. Chuck Harrison, who I talked about, he becomes an executive at Sears. He lives in this neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. They weren't allowed or are welcomed in the places where their peers would have been welcomed. And this becomes especially stinging when a company like Allstate relocates to the northern suburbs, far, far away, and then says, we want to have more internship programs, we want to have more affirmative action programs, we want to have some minorities. And I found it was a 2-hour commute to go from the south side of Chicago up to Allstate. What kid is going to do that 2-hour commute to take one of these internships? So there's a lot of factors working against, I talk about at the end, does America want a black middle class? And that's from Ramsey asking us. And when he first said it, I was like, oh, don't be ridiculous, of course, right? And then you start to add up, do they? Do we really want a black middle class? Because, of course, they'd always say, I won't accept a black neighbor, but if the right black neighbor moves next to me, if Jackie Robinson moves next to me, if Maila Jackson moves next to me, well, we know what happened when Jackie Robinson went looking for a house. He couldn't find one. This is when he was Jackie Robinson, the Jackie Robinson, wouldn't sell him a house. He had all kinds of troubles before he found one in Connecticut. Maila Jackson, the gospel singer, I talk a lot about her in here. She's on stage with Dr. King in 1963 at the rally. When she moves into Chatham, which was white at the time, they shot her windows out. They had threatening calls at all times of the day. Edward Murrow, the famous journalist, had to come to Chicago and sit down with her in her living room and try to make peace. And eventually the for sale signs went up around her. And she talks about how she felt like it was getting kicked out of a family. Like when her neighbors said, I won't accept you. They've been saying for years, if the right person moved in, I'll accept them. And then the right person moves in, and they didn't accept them.
Okay, I don't know much about the building of the freeways or the highways or the roads, but I know is there any parallel within Chicago as with St. Paul where they always planned where there were middle class, very prosperous black neighborhoods, and then they broke into them?
Yeah.
Is that anything similar?
I don't see a Rondo-like situation. Where I do see it is where the public transportation goes, especially the L train. Some of those neighborhoods are very hard to reach in that zone. But I think that's true here too. Why did they choose to run that line to Eden Prairie? Where I live, we would through North Minneapolis into Robbinsdale, Brooklyn Park, Brooklyn Center. We're begging for that line, but they chose to run it to Eden Prairie, right? So a lot of those choices, you wonder what the racial implications were. But no, I don't see a Rondo-like situation, although I have it in plenty of cities, yeah.
Okay, and just like with the transportation, we had a fight in St. Paul to get the stops in St. Paul, in like Frogtown and the Midway neighborhood.
Yeah, no, definitely. There's always some racial implications to that stuff, right? Other historians have done a really good job talking about public housing too. But this is complicated in the way I talk about it as well, because a lot of these African-American middle-class neighborhoods also rejected public housing in their neighborhoods, and so it became a class issue as well as a race issue. And again, I'm going back to the point about compassion for your subjects. Easy for us perhaps to sit back and judge. How could you reject housing in your neighborhood? Well, here's a valuable investment that they've finally been able to make to break through into these neighborhoods. And along comes the city and says, well, now that the neighborhood's black, you sure would like some public housing, right? Well, you haven't suggested public housing for this neighborhood ever before when it was a white neighborhood, and now all of a sudden, you want to put public housing in this neighborhood. So they understood the racial implications of that, as well as the class implications, right?
Yeah, and then the big tenements, what they call.
Right, a disaster.
Not nice.
Yeah, no, it was, yeah.
But isn't what you're describing, it sounds to me not very different from blockbusting either.
No,
I mean,
yeah.
I think you have to be careful not to oversimplify. They just don't want black people living next door to them, right? I mean,
Yes.
there are factors at work there
Yes.
with people whose only asset is their home, and then the seed is planted, the value of your only asset is going down.
Yeah.
Catholic parishes. I mean, there's so much more going on that I would be a little uncomfortable with it, with just kind of laying it off to don't want black people in my neighborhood.
And that's again, historians in Chicago have done wonderful work on it, right? But that's what's important about what I show in chapter 3, because in chapter 3, the African Americans moving in were of a higher income than the people that were living there already.
It's not surprising.
These neighborhoods stayed integrated for a lot longer. It was not one of those panic, let's move out quickly situations. They stayed integrated for a lot longer. In fact, I went and interviewed the last white family that still lived there all these years. And they just kind of rolled their eyes. You know, they said, the people moving in here had more education and more money than we did. And so I don't understand why people moved out. What I started to look at more is when they started to move out. So they stayed, and by the way, they made big investments in this neighborhood. Built a new YMCA, built a new Jewish community center. So it wasn't one of these things where I think my neighborhood's deteriorating, I need to move out. What I found was when their daughters became junior high age is when they started to move out. So it was a very gradual situation. First African Americans started moving in about 1954. Last whites exit in about 1967. And I can't, who asked the question about proving this down to the number. I can't prove it down to the number, but I can see when it starts to happen. And it's when their daughters, not their sons by the way, enter junior high age. Their sons, in that neighborhood, there continues to be an all-male Catholic school that whites continue to bring their sons into that neighborhood, Mount Carmel, which wins football championships all the time. They will continue to bring their sons into a black neighborhood to this Catholic school. The women's school across the street closed. So I think there's a heavy sex element that, of course, people didn't want to talk about necessarily, but the thought, and there's plenty of public opinion polls to back this up during this time, the thought of their daughters marrying an African American man was one of the things that they were off to the suburbs for. And I think that's a big factor. So I don't think blockbusting was as big of a factor in this middle class belt right here. If you get a chance and you're on the Dan Ryan, exit on 75, go towards the lake and admire these houses, admire the brick houses. And there was no reason to leave over fear of falling property values until they started to make that happen by panicking and then leaving.
But redlining didn't affect them then?
It did, but not until the neighborhood became all African American.
But that's not how redlining works. As soon as you have any African Americans in the neighborhood, the redlining is applied.
Yeah, I think that was true to an extent, but not in this neighborhood because there was so much black wealth that moved in. Independence Bank, South Shore Bank, black-owned banks in these neighborhoods. We're talking about a lot of money here. We're talking, again, African Americans moving in that had money and had been saving up that money for a long time because they couldn't buy houses and couldn't invest it. So this was not an impoverished area, to say the least. So they had their own banks. The Chatham Bank closed in 1963, and African Americans got together and in that same spot opened up Independence Bank and started the first black-owned bank in the area. And then when Harold Washington becomes mayor of Chicago, he says, we're going to make our deposits through Independence Bank, and we're going to make our deposits through South Shore Bank, and all of a sudden that gets, every time you did a paid a bill in Chicago, some of that money would go through those banks, and that makes a difference. So we're talking about a lot of money in this area.
You've concentrated on corporations in Chicago, but I would guess that trade unions, electrical workers, plumbers, and whatever, were also limiting blacks. And that's true, I think, still to this day, that you have to be the son of a current member to be a part of the electrical workers union or plumbers union for the most part.
Yeah. For those who are labor historians or interested in labor, it's a sad history in Chicago. I talk about this a little bit in chapter 1. It depended on what union it was. So, for instance, the plumbers completely closed to African Americans and stayed so. What's the internal walls that we used to have? Plasterers, right? Plasterers open to African Americans. If you came up from the South, which I talk about with the Gaines family, came from the South, was a plasterer, was able to get in the plasterers union, got a decent wage, ran for office, married very well. Irene McCoy Gaines married a socialite. His son moves out to Chatham, becomes Charles Gaines, the state representative, and that family has produced doctors and lawyers. That's all luck. He was lucky that he was in the plasterers union and not the plumbers union. I talk about this in chapter 1. So many African Americans came to Chicago and experienced downward mobility. Teachers from Mississippi who could not get licensed to teach. I've been teaching in Mississippi for 20 years. Sorry, you don't have a license here, right? Can't teach. Skilled craftsmen, and Peter, if you read Peter's book on Richmond, skilled steel workers going back to the days of slavery. That's a big misconception, that African Americans came north and they had no skills. Completely wrong. Carpenters, skilled workers galore, and then, yes, faced those Jim Crow unions, which they were.
Has there been an outward migration from Chicago, people returning to the South?
Yeah. And that's also something I talk about a little bit in the conclusion. It's a downer of a conclusion, Who would have guessed that? A reverse migration to Atlanta. When so many people came with high hopes and considered Chicago the promised land. And now we're seeing a giant reverse migration south and to the suburbs.
Can you talk a little more about the social space piece? You mentioned your country clubs and whatnot, because I'm thinking about how many of the white people that are in these workplaces had been in families that had been just in the last generation catapulted into the middle class, especially people that came from Eastern and Southern Europe and that were Catholic and that came fairly close to the immigration restriction. Then because of the FHA and because of unions, you get slapped into the middle class. And thus you have people who didn't necessarily grow up, white people who didn't necessarily grow up knowing how to perform middle class, but because you're effectively given affirmative action into the middle class, you have to learn that quickly. And I can imagine that actually creates kind of an anxious social space where you have white people who are probably just figuring that out, how to behave, and that racism becomes a huge part of how to play white middle class. So talk to me about that space, that sort of social space piece, and also where other than country clubs were people hanging out? What was happening on the weekend where these kind of decisions were getting made?
And to your point on looking at it in some of the white perspective here, I interviewed a woman, a Jewish woman, and she was lived very close to the South Shore Country Club. And South Shore Country Club excluded Jews, of course. And African Americans started to enter the neighborhood. Some whites start to leave. And the country club is starting to have some problems. And she said, all of a sudden they called up my house and said, oh, do you want to join the country club? We need some members, right? And so you start to see the beginnings of a white identity being crafted here in opposition to African Americans. anything we can do to keep out the African Americans. And again, the people moving in here, the African Americans moving in here, are a very high status and wealthy people, because for so long they've been held back in these areas that when the floodgates finally opened, they could have easily joined this country club. But they reached out to the Jewish person and said, right, golf is a big part of this. And how many years ago was it when the Masters, and there was thoughts about, are we going to let a woman into the Masters, right? And at first there was a big push, we have to do this, and then there was that pushback, like, no, they should be able to choose who they want, and this is about who you're going to associate with. And what got completely neglected there was what goes on at these clubs, and the socializing and the networking, and so many in terms of the work social spaces. So many of the African Americans talked about their white coworkers would show up and they had a mentor right from the start, and they had someone from their college who was showing them the ropes. I got a training manual dropped on my desk, and that was it, right? And I think that Carson Peary Scott anecdote that I talked about, where he was asking people to go to coffee, I think again that intimacy part. Well, what do you mean by coffee, right? And so I think that becomes the really difficult spot. And I've seen this, women executives have talked about this. And we would do in class we do this as a exercise. So you're a young woman in a corporation, you can't really figure out what's going on. Go ask your male boss to grab a beer after work. Right? And the students get it immediately. They're like, no, I can't do that. Because everybody knows why you can't do that, right? So I think some of the things I was talking about in terms of that intimacy with girls of junior high age is the same problems of intimacy at the country club, at the golf course, at the after work happy hours. I talk about how most happy hours remained segregated, even when workplaces became integrated. This was true for Jewish people too. They call it the 5 o'clock shadow, that Jews and Christians would go their separate ways at 5 o'clock after work. So there's many layers to that. It matters. It matters in corporate America. Who's getting ahead? These are tough questions.
You touched a little bit about this. I wonder if you could elaborate a bit, sort of the nature of the jobs that African Americans got pushed into in these middle class positions. And, one of the things I'm most interested in is were there things that happened when an African American ended up the boss of other white professionals? Mm-hmm. And how did that? It feels like to me that might be a spot of really interesting, to say the least.
Right. Yeah, and I think those are the type of things that a lot of people would say, this is why you can't be promoted, right? So why can't you have this job that involves contact with white people? Well, we don't want a black person to be the face of the company. So we're going to give you a job behind the scenes, but you can't have actual contact with white clients. So I think that's more like the insurance part, right? They knew, they weren't dumb. They knew that there was plenty of qualified African Americans who could do insurance, but they were always afraid that the white customer would say, I can't do this, right? Same thing with promotion. I would promote you, and I talk about this, I would promote you, but your white underlings will not accept you. And so therefore I'm not going to do it, right? It was like everything was governed by fear. And so when you get promoted, instead of getting a job where you're going to oversee people, we're going to give you a job in community relations instead. And so that's going to be your promotion. And often it paid pretty well, but it wasn't in the decision-making part of the corporation, and so therefore it wasn't going to move up further. Also, again, with the 1980s and the setbacks, when corporations start to get lean, what's the first thing to go?
Last hired first.
Yeah, and stuff like community relations is the first thing that gets cut, right? And so you start seeing a whole bunch of African Americans let go from these corporations because they're not in they call it the line decisions as opposed to the peripheral type stuff, right? So definitely governed by fear.
So you talk with the guy, I forget the name, the banker who started the bond trading desk.
Yeah.
Is part of the reason that happens because when he started it, no one thought it was going to be that big?
Probably, right? He came up with your own idea. And I'm not sure how much face-to-face contact he got in that job. That was probably more of, again, behind-the-scenes type stuff and manipulate, a whiz with numbers. And so he's manipulating the numbers in the back. But guys like him, it's difficult to read their stories because you can feel the pain, right? You can feel the pain of all the things he's been denied through his life. But at the same time, he has this tremendous sense of accomplishment, too, that I worked my way through these things, and I made it. And I'd say, again, to your point, that's probably still true today.
It's true today. It's true with a lot of people up and down the executive chains in corporations.
Yeah.
I mean, and one of the things that I think is important when we think about those, and some people would call them sort of ghetto positions or ghettoized kinds of jobs. HR positions were a big part of that, right?
Oh.
So African Americans executives tend to be pushed into HR. You mentioned that, but they weren't necessarily in operations or marketing or, again, some of those positions that had huge budgets and clear decisions.
Yeah. I've got examples in here of chemists who got hired as HR. And it just drove them crazy, right? Like, you say we're short on these science jobs. You say we don't have enough qualified African Americans. I am a qualified African American in chemistry. I get hired, and then I'm in HR. Ord Combs, the writer, that's how he got his first corporate job, HR, right? And he just said, I could do this in my sleep. It was no challenge at all, but that was the position that I was hired to do. And those things are the first thing to get cut when corporations got lean.
Okay, you mentioned Jackie Robinson.
Yep.
And going maybe kind of around the same year or maybe earlier, that was like a Jesse Owens thing. He couldn't find anything, so they picked him up at the Department of Parks and Recreation in Chicago.
And the space that this community organized around and denied to the Nation of Islam is called Jesse Owens Park now. Yeah. It gets complicated in that scenario. Yeah.
Just one more thing, just curious in terms of how you're looking at, so recently, and some people in the room might know about the Scott collection that was recently republished about African Americans here in the Twin Cities. And I'm wondering, in a lot of those, it's almost like pictorial resumes, if you will. I mean, so, and a lot of the folks who were featured in this collection, which dates back starting in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, of African Americans who were getting jobs, positions here, many of them executives. I'm wondering if you've looked at that and done some of the comparisons in terms of what was going on in Chicago versus what was happening here in the Twin Cities.
Yeah.
Because I do think that that's a really great resource in terms of identifying locally what was going on with African Americans getting positions, executive positions in the 50s, 60s, particularly 60s and 70s, and what they were going through and how they were presenting, if you will, the black middle class within the Twin Cities.
And one of the things that I talk about in here is that I would have liked to do more comparisons like that. And I would have liked to talk about when African Americans moved up into corporations, where did they go? Because often moving up into a corporation means relocating. One of the sad parts I found is that African Americans would turn down those offers to relocate because it had been so hard to find a house in Chicago that suited their desires. They weren't going to go through that again and move to Detroit or move to Edina or Wayzata, because it was so miserable to find this one house. One of them he says, moving is like stealing. I feel like I've stolen this house because the had to go through a Jewish intermediary to buy the house. Neighbors rejected me. People moved away. Won't play with my kids. I got red paint. In the one example in Marinook, I got red paint thrown on my house on the south side of Chicago. The thought of relocating was out of the question. So African Americans were denied those promotions because they said, no, I'm not going to do it. And I think we can all understand why they would do that. So you had less executive mobility between these cities. So I think comparisons would be great, but we have to recognize that too. Why didn't we see more? It's because Who would want to go through that again? Especially when you've finally found a neighborhood like Chatham on the south side where it becomes a very strong African American community and a power base politically. Now, I don't know if anyone knows John Stoker here. So when Daley was mayor of Chicago, John Stroger, an African American, was the president of the Cook County Board. Cook County is much bigger than Chicago. He could deliver, right? That one last white family that I interviewed on the south side, they said, we never had any problem with like street maintenance or anything down here. Right? We never had any problems with clearing snow because John Stroger lives right down the street from us. Everything gets cleared. And that's a ton of patronage jobs too. To your point, in government jobs, that's a ton. Cook County is a ton of patronage jobs. So that's a real power base. Why would you want to leave that when you know that it's just going to go through the same struggles in a different city?
Did Mayor Daley, the famous mayor, did he facilitate the upward movement of African Americans who moved into the city? Or did he do nothing, or did he stand in their way, or what was his role in the whole thing? He's such a controversial, he was back then, mayor.
Yeah, I think to Ryan's point, and a lot of people have talked about this, Mayor Daley never understood that he had become white and he wasn't Irish at the bottom of the heap anymore. He always saw himself as an Irishman who was the discriminated minority of Chicago. And so he couldn't understand African Americans because he just thought, well, I've got it worse than you do. We're at the bottom here, right? We got kicked around. And so, somebody brought up the Robert Taylor homes and things like that. I think that's his legacy. The way he decided to save Chicago was to ghettoize African Americans in these public housing traps. I don't see him doing much for African American middle class people at all. The black middle class finally revolts against him in 1972. Ralph Metcalf, who is another sprinter, who has a lot of struggles finding work, but becomes a city councilman in this area. He was an Olympian. He gets pulled over by the police and treated very rudely in 1972. And of course, this had been happening a lot to African Americans, but now it happened to Ralph Metcalf, and he starts to lead the African American revolt against the Daley machine in that period. And that's when you start to see, this is getting into the weeds of Chicago politics here, but Chicago had 6 black aldermen under the Daley machine, but they were called the Silent Six because they would never go against Daley. And Ralph Metcalf was one of those Silent Six. But we could get into a whole other discussion here about policing and crime. And once that happens, he rejects the Daley machine, and you start to see the rise of the Stroger machine, which we never hear about, but was pretty powerful in Chicago. I don't give Mayor Daley much credit.
Was he what should be called corrupt? Well, that's beyond the scope.
Yeah.
I know that.
Yeah. I talk about a little bit in here with the outfit, which is Chicago's organized crime family. Chicago's organized crime family, a lot of people say, well, it was run by Italians. Wrong. It had Greeks, it had Jews, Gus Alex, Jake Guzik, Ralph Pierce. I don't know what his ethnicity was, but these were all high players inside the outfit. Guess who wasn't allowed inside the outfit? African Americans, right? Something happens. Blacks have their own very profitable gambling machines in the 1940s. Well, from the 19-teens to the 1940s. Yeah, 19-teens to the 1940s. Something happens, and it has something to do with Daley, where they lose their political cover in the 1940s. And one after another, they get knocked off. Assassinated, kidnapped. Ed Jones gets kidnapped. I talk about that in the book. And then he runs off to Mexico with a warning. Something happened in that period where Mayor Daley takes over, where African Americans lost their political cover, because they were paying pretty well, right? We're going to run these gambling operations. We're going to pay politicians to not pay attention to it. But I can't prove that Daley was that's a part of that. So, but something happened.
So why don't we adjourn to signing and selling
All right.
books?
Thank you very much.
Please thank Will.